Today I am doing the second half of a video I did before. It's an essay by Pete Walker. It's treating the traumatized self-relating. And I pretty much shared most of what his views are on how the inner bully gets installed, how we develop this horrible inner critic. We start to relate to ourselves with disgust and contempt, and we become psychologically dependent on narcissists to replace our parents in that constantly trying to be perfect. And also we become narcissists, or we isolate, or we become so demeaned by or diminished by a mass of failed relationships where we feel persecuted, or we actually are persecuted, and it just becomes a bunch of inner critics. So now I'm going to be talking more about the recovery period that comes after that. So in treatment, in healing. So reawakening and reviving self-compassion and self-protection. Therapists help survivors awaken instincts of being fierce for ourselves, being kind to ourselves. This is things like kind treatment to ourselves. We emphasize our own essential worthiness and positive noticing. This helps us to learn how to recognize and defend ourselves from toxic relationships. We start to actually want better for ourselves. That comes from how we estimate ourselves. Thriving depends on the self-empathy because during life's difficult times, when we treat ourselves graciously as things go up and down, we develop this ability to even grieve. Grieving is how to not arrest the self-compassion. When we cannot feel even sorry for ourselves or feel sad for our own suffering, we're unable to grieve, we get stuck. So grieving is called egosyntonic crying, and it's an anxiety releaser, tension, fear, we become relaxed. And crying actually metabolizes the physical and emotional pain that's past or present. Very effective when we also have some anger about the unfairness of what's happening, either now or then. Angry crying is like our earliest language when we're in distress. Think of an infant. And it evaporates the obsessions, the endlessly circulating worries. And if we don't have this emotional release, then what happens is it wafts up to the left brain, as we would call it, and it becomes making everything drastic. It becomes very cognitive, and it's like fearfully thinking, and we become a hypochondriac, like I'm not okay, everything's not going to be okay, this is wrong. Instead, when we actually release that emotion, the fear itself ends because we connect with our ability to cope with problems, these problems which exist in the mind. And instead of this abject hopelessness, which we might even call learned helplessness, there's nothing I could do, is when we start to cry it out, it's like the kids need compassion consistently, like even when we're feeling very in pain, very shamed or guilty for how we're behaving in the world, or that we're a failure, even when we haven't done anything wrong. To mature and to have this compassion become automatic, to internalize this kind treatment, there has to be a backdrop regularly, not just when we're pleasing somebody, some element of unconditional compassion. And if we never really receive empathy, or like so rarely, and this could even be just like we're constantly being criticized, or the other one's not responding, there's unresponsiveness, the self-compassion becomes replaced with toxic shame. It deadens the soul, the spirit, and it obliterates our own self-supportive reflexes it makes the child easier to control, and the parents and the caretakers get the outcome that they want, the temporary fix. So we would say this is like going into the topic of neglect, which installs toxic shame as deeply as abuse, because it could be verbal, spiritual, emotional. It's basically not interacting in a positive way with the child, not noticing good about them, ignoring their accomplishments, not even delighting in the daily miracles of their developments, whether it's self-expression, not interacting with them in a loving or lighthearted way. And extended neglect drives most kids to embrace perfectionism, trying so hard to be like noticed, to be loved, to be delighted in. Consequently, neglected children attend to themselves with negatively, obsessing about lacking value and not being good enough and being flawed fundamentally, fatally. Disappointment suppressed, normal emotions, normal mood shifts, sadness. Basically, there's this attempt to never invite any parental attacking or shunning. You know, it makes it worse. It's like, I want to be noticed for positive, at least not for negative. But then I'll do anything to avoid being noticed negatively. Showing anger about being hurt, especially or unfairly, is especially dangerous and typically greeted with more punishment and abandonment. Self-hate, toxic shame, belief that emotional pain is a fatal flaw, compulsive attempts to numb the self, distract, suppress any feelings that are not happy, trying to pump up happiness, having agony in an alienated way, and depression all happen if we don't choose recovery. In recovery, the dormant self-kindness can come up in the presence of being related to with compassion. It usually starts with somebody else seeing these more difficult sides of us and us then feeling safe to ventilate this pain that could be past or present, whether it's emotional, expression or verbal. And this sadness and madness is instinctive when we feel hurt. So we need to metabolize this pain through crying and angering. We need a witness who's validating while grieving for what was left ungrieved. We may need to protest or work through intricacies multiple times. Self-compassion happens when we get that relief from crying, and self-protection from angering. With a therapist, a client attempts to establish trust and repair emotional acceptance. It's really vital that the therapist understands their role, that this is so important for them to realize that they're another human being that, will not criticize or make this one feel so helpless against this merciless, entrenched, relentless inner critic by being on the outside something that actually helps the one calm down and feel it's okay to explore this territory without jumping automatically to being judged. There's comfort in being seen and accepted fully in all aspects of the self. So in this gradual sharing with others who are safe, starting with that one person, it becomes a shift into not discovering that there's nothing inside that needs to be hated, destroyed, avoided, or pathologized. And this is where we begin to feel intimacy and experience, through the depths of our pain also, and learning to commiserate. And therapists help most when they model this self-acceptance and vulnerability, and around imperfections, demonstrating how to be without self-contempt, being a loyal ally to oneself no matter what suffering. And so as the person starts to share their pain and their suffering, and this therapist doesn't respond with contempt or judgment or triggering the client by taking a side or telling them how to be, or unconsciously punishing or abandoning, even emotionally in any way, that's when the change can start to shift, and it becomes something that the person can do for themselves and even start to connect with others this way, groups or individuals, feeling safe to share this part of their self for the first time in their life. If the therapist wants to revive this developmentally arrested, self relating, it could be really dangerous, or not dangerous, it could be really just do even more harm if the therapist is not able to be demonstrating, being a loyal ally, self-compassion, compassion, just being that presence, that witness, who's not going to judge the grieving, who's going to be a comfort, who's going to be safe. So now with self-protection, survivors often get especially intense punishment for attempting to stand up and protect themselves against abuse, and parents quickly extinguish child's drive to stand up against injustice. Contempt is the weapon of choice of many over-controlling parents. Intimidation and disgust drowns the child's self-expression in fear and shame. Such extreme rejection eventually causes children to identify with the aggressors, and then they start to blame themselves automatically for any parental upset, no matter if it's fair or unfair or unjust. Perfectionism becomes a salvation fantasy of like constantly infectious, contentment draining self-dissatisfaction. Like nothing I do is enough, and nothing's enough. I'm going to keep trying. But it's literally draining and infects in many ways. We start to, if we're in this, and this is part of my history, we start to go against our own looks, speech, moods, energy levels, actions, inactions. Everything we say or do must be absolutely beyond any reproach, or we start to spiral into this persevering self-castigation. And as a goal of being mistake-free is impossible, it's elusive, we end up starting to see ourselves as one big giant mistake. So the next step is like really about, now that we like talked a little bit about the recovery, so how do we attain inner and outer safety? And so the first priority is often just break contact with abusers that are in the outer world. There's already, enough work on the inner safety. So inner safety must be prioritized because the inner critic becomes a 24/7 manager. The untreated survivor's psyche is basically a triggering mechanism of emotional flashbacks which demean and frighten into an abandonment depression. We can become trapped for days or months in fear, even years, some people lifetime. Shame and hopelessness is how we get trapped if we remain untreated. We are inculcated with self-sabotage when we're too young and powerless to fight it, so we need to learn to intensely rebuff it in order to get enough traction so we can rescue ourselves from the constant, incessant self-belittling. Shame, according to Erik Erikson, is like why we end up in self-punishment and self-alienation, and it's when healthy blame is turned against ourselves. When we practice anger self-protectively against the critic, it, morphs toxic shame into a healthy and appropriate blaming of neglect and abuse that forced us into this self-contempt. When we practice sadness, self-compassion, tears, gradually the ability to rescue ourselves from being stranded, we find support in recovery, which is persistent identification of the inner critic attacks. Oh, that's my inner critic. Oh, that's my inner critic. We encourage anger at how trauma turned myself against me to persecute myself. And also teaching skills to fight, learning skills to fight the inner critic messages that trigger and trap. And all of this could be private, public, out loud, silent. We commiserate over the bullying, the gaslighting, the scapegoating, the being controlled by another's contempt. We can be actually learning empathy for another once we have empathy for ourselves. And this anger can muffle and shrink the inner critic. Like, we can even rage, in our anger against the inner critic as a proxy for being unable to do that to the caregivers that started this whole spiral. And often, they are part of the spiral. It was done to them too. Until a healthy self-protective ego has room to evolve out of the arrested development. So this grows our capacity to be angry on others' accounts. Like I said, our empathy says we're going to protect others too, especially if we want to be in a relationship or have children. We need to be able to do this, right? Instead of being stuck in, we're not allowed to get angry, and then a child just being around us is not allowed to get angry. We get angry at wrong. A child is allowed to not be wronged either. So this is the first steps to healthy relationship and protective of others, basically. And this is for others' sake, really, because who had their healthy ego development, the user-friendly manager and protector of the psyche was forced into becoming a superego, which sees us. So in other words, we do this for our own sake, but then it's also for others, because sometimes we see in someone else the manager and protector of their psyche has been turned into, like us, a superego that sees them as negative. It becomes an inner bully. So we can actually start to recognize someone else's inner bully and be kind to them and be compassionate. Angering is not hurting anyone or hurting ourselves, unless, of course, we're being abused. Then we might need to use the anger in order to break contact or protect ourselves which is recommended for recovering. But as the heat and the rage fights the critic inside, the process takes away, it's called like the rulership of the critic, the rug is pulled out from under them. They're not on the throne anymore. And we can recover the instinctual self-protection. We can become wiser and kinder managers of our own psyche, and then we can also extend this to others with wisdom and kindness. This catharsis of setting limits with the critic naturally leads to self-compassion, which will include crying and grieving, because we can't go through those same old patterns where we think we have control and so on. I'm not going to go into it. I'm using mostly his schematic cycle of healing from and the whole kind of structure. The big spiel, how he puts it. And for all the suffering that the parents attacked by, we have an extension of that as the inner critic. So we restore the ability to be unrelentingly self-supportive. We start to have substitution techniques of the thoughts and perspectives. This might be known as CBT to those who are familiar. And we emotionally empower through that. We reclaim these instincts of self-compassion and self-protection with lots of real releasing of the sorrow, the grief, with anger and tears for what was not just, for how it hurt, for how it wasn't fair, for it's not right. The self-supportive emotional responses used can be in emergency situations like a triage for new or even flashback injury, when we remember to self-esteem and we come to our own aid. We can cut off that negative noticing with this heat of our anger and replace it with a deeply felt, often with a lot of tears, affirmation of our attributes and our essential worthiness, and this self-perpetuating developmental process for initiating self-empathy and kindness will give us initiative and courage and assertiveness, and we grow in abilities to make boundaries. We set limits around what's unfair, and as mentioned, we can develop more deeply in relationships. We can have intimacy and experience connection. We can be there for others. We can be kind to others. We can experience families and children. We have creative self-expression, which is freed and can start to grow and develop. This is after, we're not in that survival mode of constantly surviving against the inner critic that's lodged. And finally, we can actually allow ourselves to have a mistake, a mood shift. We can be at grace for ourselves. Energy lull or less than perfect utterance. We become whole as we're growing. We're not constantly thinking that we're even able to know what's perfect, because we're changing and situations are changing, and we become more present, more adaptive. We get to develop some of those skills that never developed in our childhood when these issues started to get stunted. And eventually we can start to relate to ourselves in ways that are more empowering and serving and loving, protective and kind. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope this was valuable. I really love this work that he's done and the way he's been able to synthesize, material from it. And I wish you well. I wish you healthy self-relating. Thank you. Bye.